Welcome back from lunch. I hope we're all nice and sleepy. I'm going to try to not keep you there. It's going to be great. Starting a little bit late, but it's okay. I'm amazing, so you're going to love it. So, I'm here to talk to you today about internationalization, which I had to learn how to say more than once or twice in an hour for this talk, so you're welcome. Let's get to know each other before I start. I'm Ellie. I'm a UI developer. My actual title is Agile UI developer, but fine. At Trainline, which is like kayak, but for trains in Europe. I live in London. That's me. I'm on Twitter at EllieBelly. Please tweet at me questions, comments, and I have a prize for anyone who can get me up here looking like professional that I can send to my parents and prove that I'm a real adult. So that's your challenge for the day. And I want to tell you a little story about my life. I'm not a narcissist. This has a point, I promise. So I was born in Mexico. I grew up and was raised in Nicaragua. And then I moved here for college, actually upstate in Poughkeepsie. Any people? Yeah? That usually doesn't get that at all in London. It's like in Poughkeepsie, you know, right? And then I did a semester abroad in China, in Shanghai, because I was, you know, young and energetic still. And now I live in London in the UK. And that's a little bit about my life. For those of you who are wondering, these are where some of those places are. Sometimes, you know, it's okay, it's a learning moment. Sometimes people don't know. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is that I lied. Has anyone here tried to internationalize a website before? Was it a piece of cake? The truth is that it's actually a really complex topic. It has a lot of layers, and for some reason it hasn't been like fully fleshed out, even though it's been around for a while. But I'm here to show you all how it doesn't have to be that way. And once you leave here, you'll be a little more equipped to be a citizen of the, you know, global world. So first, let's clarify some things. Internationalization is often written as I-18N, and sometimes that's unclear. So let's do a little back to school. This is something called a numeronym, which is a number-based word. Which can be different types of things. So like numbers as sounds, like canine from police dog units, or later from texting. Numbers as meaning, like 411, you know, or 007, like Idris Elba's new job, hopefully. Or adding up the number of letters in between the first and the last, and then using that number as a number instead of the middle of the word. Wow, what a good idea. Makes sense, right? So you might have seen this in accessibility, which is A11Y or ally, or localization, which is L10N, right? Which they're not easier to say, they're just easier to write. Bonus, here's the numeronym for numeronym. Just want to get that out of the way. So when I wanted to talk about internationalization, I was like, how can I explain what it really is and why it's so important? So I turned to my most trusted advisor, and I sort of did a little soul searching to see how I could like get you guys on board. So let's look at statistics, because I thought that would wake you up after lunch. Here are all of the languages of the top, I don't know, like billion websites in the world or something. You'll notice that 52-ish% of them are in English, followed far second with Russian, 6%, German, Spanish, Japanese. The number of people on the internet that use these sites speak these languages. So 5% in English, 20% Chinese, 8% Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese, so on and so forth. You'll notice that these don't match. And that is where the problem begins. Because not only are we keeping people out of the web, there's millions of people coming online every single day. And I'm not talking like some like post-millennial American baby. I'm talking like millions of people in India, in China, Indonesia, the emerging markets, Africa. And a lot of those people are not English speakers or culturally the same as a lot of the websites. And it is our responsibility, I think, as web developers or app developers or documentation technical writers, I assume, to make the web more accessible to all. So the first thing I want to just make really clear right now, and kind of like Joe mentioned earlier with the subway emergency things, internationalization is about accessibility at its core. Because we want people to have access to the web, but if we don't make it accessible to them, with something as simple as language, we're shutting the doors. So let's do some more school. Internationalization. If you international, and this is from W3C standards, and I really like this description. I think it's super spot on and exactly what I wanted to say, so copy paste. If you internationalize, you design or develop your content, application, specification, not just website, and so on in a way that ensures it will work well for or can be easily adapted for. This doesn't say that your site is translated yet. It says that you can adapt for it later. Users from any culture, region, or language. So it's not just like English versus Spanish versus Chinese, right? It's also regional differences. The keen-eyed among you may or may not have noticed that I have been changing the way I write internationalization from Z and S in this talk, and also the schedule I think has it with an S, because I live in London, and in London we write words different and better. Just kidding, I love Z's. So it's not necessarily a language, right? It can also be regional differences, is what I'm trying to say here. So how do we do this on the internet? Now, some of you, as I saw from hands, will have probably done this, some of you may have not. You have a bunch of code, and instead of putting in like hard-coded strings, you put in a template or a variable or something that, like a placeholder that you can switch up. And then you have some sort of like external resources, like strings in English. Notice I used the UK flag. And then you'll add a language, and so your code can point to that language, and it will just fill in the blanks, and so on and so forth. But it's not that straightforward. There's a lot that we have to think about when we do this. Obviously, language is the first and sort of most obvious version of that. There's also a writing system. Not everyone uses the ABC alphabet. You have Chinese characters, you have Thai script, like the world is huge and varied and beautiful. There's date formatting, time formatting, currency. Is anyone here not American? What date is this? Yeah, I know, right? Exactly. Right? Please, no fights in the audience. I'd like to avoid that today. So there's that. Writing direction, not all languages are left to right or right to left. I'm not going to be talking about this today because it's like a whole other topic. Ordering, pluralization, stuff like when you have one thing or many things. Does anyone here speak Russian? Okay, so in Russian, you can't just have like one thing and then plural things. You have like categories. So like there's one word for one, and then there's another word from like 2 to like 5 things. And then there's a different word for like 6 to like 11 things. So it's not easy. So if you want to localize to Russian, you should get a consultant. There's grammar, sometimes verbs are in front of adjectives, that kind of thing. Relative time, so like blah blah days ago, you know, like in Facebook comments or something. Or if you're a GitHub user, sometimes it's like 25 seconds from now, which I never really understood. Has that ever happened to you? When it's like slow. And then there's locale. So locale is like the grouping of all of these things put together. And often when you localize something or internationalize something, you're localizing for a locale. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But all of these things have to be in your brain when you're trying to do this. Piece of cake, right? So I decided that, yeah, it is a piece of cake. It's just a different cake. Like, it has sparkles, and it has tears, and there's, I don't know, it's shiny. So I decided that because internationalization has so many layers, I would make you my own cake so that we can all have a delicious learning experience. So here's my cake. It's a rainbow cake. And in it are some of the things that make up internationalizing on the web. See, I already did it. And a lot of these are web standards or just common practice or technologies. Worth noting that the top layers are implementation details. They're like libraries and wrappers. And I'm going to talk about some of them, but they're not the only ones that exist. It's just the ones that like I use at work, you know. for explanation purposes. So let's begin. Let's go through a tour. I will be talking a little bit about React. Apologies for anyone who is not well-versed. I just didn't want to make examples and everything. So layer number one is Unicode. Unicode was like the pinnacle, the advent of like modern globalized websites was Unicode. Unicode lets us use emoji and scripts and all of the characters for all the diacritics, all of the languages in all parts of the world. Never not use like UTF-8. I guess there's UTF-16 too, but that's like just baseline, make sure that's in there. There's something I learned writing this talk called the Internet Engineering Task Force. Is anyone here on it? No, great, cool. Have you heard of it? Yeah, okay, a couple of you nerds, it's fine. They release these things called best common practices, which is like a standard, if you will. I assume they look like this because a girl can dream. But they have this best common practice called BCP 47, catchy, I know, which is tags for identifying locales or languages. And what it says in BCP 47 is that when you want to identify a locale, you're going to shape it like this. You're going to have a language tag, which is usually 2 or 3 letters, and then a dash, and then a series of subtags. So, for example, here we have English as spoken in the US. That's the locale for American English, which is the default on Chrome, even if you live in London. Fun fact. Then there's English for Great Britain. The second one is Mongolian, as written in the Cyrillic alphabet, as spoken in Mongolia. So that's what sort of all those, every sort of writing system has its own tag. The third one is Chinese, as written in traditional characters, as spoken in Hong Kong. And there's also numbers which are for groups of regions. So 419 is Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's Spanish, as spoken in that region. So if you remember my life story, these are my locales, technically, depending on where I am at a given time or what I'm trying to learn. So if you're developing an app and you want me to use it, what are you going to show me? And that's really the crux of the problem here, because how can you be sure? Like maybe I was abroad in China and you served me something in Chinese and I couldn't read it because I was a good student. So this is a big one. Always, 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 always let your user choose what locale they want. Whether that's like a drop-down or a user setting, put it in a cookie, I don't care. Always let the user pick what they want. You don't know their story, you don't know if they've moved or are trying to learn a language. If there's anything you take away from this, it's this. So moving up in the cake, and this was one of my favorite things I found out writing this. There's a thing called the CLDR, which is Common Locale Data Repository, which is the entire contents of every commonality in languages saved in a file. Like names of months, names of countries, like time zones, and how you say that time zone in that language. It's like Eastern Standard Time, but in Russian. And that's just, it's like 20 megs, and you can download it and use it and look at it. So here are some of the things that you can find in this repository. It's maintained by Unicode, it's open source, I think volunteers can contribute to it. It has a really ugly website, you should check it out. Translations of names of things, language scripts, what plural, what capitalization you're supposed to use for like months. Calendar conventions, like does your week start on a Monday or a Sunday? That's always been confusing to me. Here's a code example of what it looks like. It's an XML. So this is the Spanish, I think, CLDR for abbreviated week names, followed by full week names. So if you wanted to use that in your app, you could. The problem is nobody likes working with XML, am I right? So there's libraries. You can find all of the CLDR on GitHub in like JSON if you want to play with it, if you're feeling tinkery. Oftentimes developers won't interact with this, but it's there if you need it. There are libraries, most libraries are wrappers on wrappers on wrappers on this, so let's move up the layers of the cake and see what else is here. The next layer is the ICU. The ICU is International Components for Unicode, and it was originally written as a Java and C++ library, which I know it's not our thing, but bear with me. And what this did back in the day is it defined something called the ICU message format. And the message format has become sort of like a very global standardized way of writing string templates. So when you want to put in like variables in your strings, but you still want to be able to internationalize them, you can use this format. And so I'm going to teach you how to use it right now. So it looks like this. You have a string, and you can put in like a template string, like handlebarsy style. So welcome, and then your name. You can also tell it to format a number. So for example, there were 1,000 people there. This was not written for this conference, but fine. So for example, in Spain, you do 1,000 separators with a period instead of a comma. And so ICU will take care of that for you if you tell it what the variable name is and then what type it is. So it's like a reserved word. You can tell it to format dates. So my birthday is blah, blah, blah. And then depending on where you are and what locale you have, it'll format it for you. And then you can also add a third option, which is like options, like short, long, that kind of thing. You can do selections. So you can say, if the variable I pass you in is one of these, use this string instead of this other string. This is mostly because some languages have gendered nouns, and then some languages don't, and it gets really hard. If anyone here speaks any other Romance languages, you know. And then you can do stuff like plurals, and this is where you would put categories in if you were translating into Russia, not only for one and other, but for one, few, many, and then other. So you send in a variable, you tell it it's a plural, and then you give it all the options. It's like an if statement, but in string format. Next level of the cake, be warned. There is an internationalization API that exists. ECMA, 402, ECMAScript, something. And it has these three main functions. And it took me many years to realize this was a thing. And it's because we don't use it that much, because I don't think it's ready. But let's move on from that. No, they were trying to make it better, but it is, so if you go into JavaScript right now, into your terminal, into your console, you can do this thing. You call new intel, and then what you do is you initialize it with your options. So you say new number format, because I want to format a number. And then you pass it the options, and it gives you back this already formatted object. And then once you have that, you can call dot format on it. I think, yep, dot format, and then pass it in the thing you want to format. The problem with this is that for every different thing you'd want to use, you'd have to create a new initialized object of this, and it starts getting really expensive, and especially in React, where you're re-rendering things, and where do you put it in the app? It's a mess. But it's super helpful for the library authors. Thank you for that. It has OK browser support. Some of the older browsers don't support it. There's polyfills. But there are libraries. And disclaimer, these are not the only libraries. There are other solutions. And I've gotten crap for this on Twitter before. This is just what I know. I am sorry if I didn't talk about your library. I'm sure it's great. I love it. You're a star. I use Format.js. It's an open source library written by Yahoo, I think. It's not super actively maintained, but it's pretty stable. And it has wrappers for React, Ember, Handlebars, and Dust right now, but they do encourage you to write your own if you want to use a different framework. And what they do is they created a set of tools that uses the ICU and uses the CLDR and uses the Unicode and polyfills the JavaScript libraries. And it exposes that in sets of GitHub NPM packages. So you have message format, which is like for translations, and that uses the ICU messages. And then here are some helpers. But then, so if you, for example, hypothetically were using React, this is what it would look like. So you import the format React Intel library wrapper. You make, I don't know, a button. And it just exposes components where you can say, I want a formatted message, which is a translated string. The ID is the ID that it's going to match in my string resource file, which is often like a JSON or something. So you say, this is my primary sign-in button, and you can add a default message. So if you haven't maybe localized to a specific language, it can fall back to like English or something. And then you can pass it in variables. So like the name, is EmpireJS, and so when this gets rendered, it'll plug it in. We know how variables work, right? So this is an example of what like a language resource file might look like. It's JSON, it has the IDs that match your components. So this is like a Spanish resource file that has variables. It has some like gender stuff. It has some plural stuff. Because depending on like, maybe it's like an inbox thing, and it's like if you have 0 messages or 1 message, that kind of thing. It also exposes the functions just in JavaScript straight up if you don't want to use the components, just intil.format message with the ID, and it'll do it for you. And so that's, I think, a really nice topper for our beautiful, artful internationalization cake. The one thing I will say is that, yes, you can know all the standards, and yes, you can know how to approach it. But there's a really big logistics problem with localization. And if you've tried this, maybe you've experienced it where you want to write some code, you update a string, you send the string to be translated, the translator's like ghost, and then you're like, I cannot release my app in any language until the translations come back, or maybe one language will be behind another language. And so there's this like approach now called continuous localization, which is where you automatically and seamlessly try to make that process work. So there's a lot of like this as a service providers that exist now, where you can like plug it into your GitHub, and then it'll like your string will get translated and get committed back in, and it'll like speed up the process. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges with localization, besides getting like buy-in from the top, is making it a seamless developer experience. It never is, at least not for us. And we've had to localize recently because we like got stuck in like 24 countries, which has been a fun ride. So it's always good to shop around if you're going to try to localize. Try to think of what your team will need. Think of what your development process is like. Can you afford it? Are you a startup? Are you a big corp? That kind of thing. That being said, internationalization is much, much, much easier to integrate early into the project. You can bake it in later, but the beauty of internationalization is that you can bake it into your code without actually translating anything for a while. So like you can write the code in an adaptable way and then localize it later when it's relevant or you can afford it or whatever. So if anybody I hear is starting in a new project, I would urge you to try to keep this in mind from the start, even if you don't think you're going to need it, because it will come back to bite you. So what have we seen? Internationalize all the things. Look, I used the S again. Internationalization is part of accessibility. You are keeping people, especially here, actually, because how many people here speak Spanish? Yeah, this was much less in London. I feel like New York, thank you. But if I was standing up here and I started giving this presentation in Spanish and you or your company had paid hundreds of dollars to attend, you wouldn't like that very much, maybe. And that's the same way with the internet. Like maybe your grandmothers don't speak English, but they still should be able to access the web. So that's the thing. I think we have a responsibility to do it and make it a priority. It's supported by a bunch of standards. People have thought this through before. They've put it on paper. Try to get to know a little bit of that because it helps, especially when you're communicating with translators or with other developers. If you're all on the same page, it'll go much, much smoother. Try to start early if you can. That's a top tip. We learned a lot from that. This is the most important one. Always, always, always let your user pick their own locale. Always let your users pick their own locale. Great, I'm glad you get it, thank you. And this is just like a quick hot tip. German is a great first language to try to internationalize for because the words are super long. So if your CSS doesn't handle that, you will find out with German. So like, start there. There's also like fake languages, but I think this is fun. Because we had a button that just said continue, and then in German it was like this long, and we were like, we need the designers back here. Which is why it's important to put it in earlier, because it's stuff like this, where you're like, oh, we didn't account for the inflation in Venezuela, and now our thing that was $20 is 35 million, and we didn't leave room for it. So those are my hot internationalization tips. Thank you for listening. I'm on Twitter. Tweet at me. Come say hi. It's great to be here.